Hello and welcome back to the Potential Podcast. Today we have Ken Sofer on. Ken, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Chelsea.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to have you. Ken is the founder and principal of New Colossus Advisors, a communications and strategy firm, as well as an adjunct professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City for foreign policy. So, Ken, you have been busy designing courses, advising clients. You also used to work at the IRC, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I spent basically the last decade working for a humanitarian organization before I moved into my new roles.
From this, you have a lot of experience in terms of working on the global stage, interacting with a variety of different stakeholders, especially in areas where there's uncertainty. And that is the name of the game essentially in the world right now. So I thought you would be a great person to have on the podcast. Also, full disclosure, we are both alumni of SC. So it's just always great to have a fellow Trojan on.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy to be on the podcast. And there's just so much I've been thinking about really in this context. These emerging technologies we're seeing today are coming at a really interesting moment. I think in particular compared to the moment where the internet was born. The internet was built and regulated in this moment of international consolidation and a sort of, a consolidating and strengthening international order. AI is emerging at this moment where the international order is fracturing. And we're seeing, this increasing this sort of competition mindset over a lot of international challenges in a way that we did not see in the 90s and early 2000s. And my background is a lot in, humanitarian contexts and places where conflict emerges. And so we see that how the sort of breakdown of the rules-based order is impacting, crisis and conflicts. But I've been pretty fascinated about the way that emerging technologies have supercharged a lot of these trends and the way that emerging technologies like AI are interacting with this shift towards competition and a shift towards fracturing in the international system.
Definitely. I think I would be really interesting to hear since you have expertise in this area. Before we get to the meta layer, I feel like that's when I've had a lot of conversations lately has been at the meta layer, which is very important in terms of governance and stakeholder engagement. I mean, I'm very interested in power and what creates it, what you can use for leverage, and what determines it. And I do think that's evolving, just like you said. So with that in mind, given that we have these technologies and kind of this breakdown of order, this comes exactly into your wheelhouse in terms of conflict. So what have you seen in terms of technologies, whether it's beyond the Ukrainian front or other issues? I mean, I feel like there's been a lot of development.
Yeah, first, just to take a step back, I think it's important to understand the incentive structure that the kind of rules-based system or the liberal international order, as it was often referred to, created, and what is that sort of incentive structure has been replaced by. We've seen this shift, not necessarily towards great power competition between the US and China, although we have seen some of it. What we've really seen in this emerging order is many more geopolitical rivals trying to fight for power, right? It's not just one or two countries. It's not just the major powers. You have a whole suite of actors that are exerting their influence, that are looking for levers of influence. So there's just many more buyers and sellers in this international market of influence. Second, the alliance structures and the set of relationships have gone from these very deep, long-term strategic relationships, often that are values-based, to much more fluid, shallow, issue-based relationships. So there's a lot more volatility and a lot of the alignment of interests and relationships. And finally, we've seen this shift from, again, this sort of longer-term rules or values-based, set of kind of long-term rules towards much more transactional deal-making, right? This is really about who's going to get me the best deal today, and I'm not going to worry too much about our relationship tomorrow because I can find a different buyer tomorrow. And I think it created it's created these three different real shifts in incentives. First is a lot of the global cooperation on issues of shared importance, like climate change, has really been unraveling. Second, we've seen conflict used increasingly as a tool for power and profit. And I think one of the most interesting shifts to me is that the return on investment for war has just completely outpaced the return on investment for peace, right? So instead of the peace dividend, this focus on let's stabilize countries, let's get some peace because you have all this potential economic productivity that happens in places that are safe and stable. Instead, I think a lot of conflict actors are realizing we actually don't have to invest a lot of money to destabilize a neighbor, to gain a little bit of leverage in a political situation, to extract some resources, right? The return on investment for war has gone through the roof. And then finally, we've seen, I think, the worst abuses of impunity really have been enabled with very little accountability. And so we see this concentration and abuse of power at the hands of the most powerful against those with the least amount of power and very little accountability for it. So we've seen decline in respect for international humanitarian law, the laws of war, et cetera. And I think this attitude of the rules are for suckers, whether that's in warfare, whether that's in democratic politics, whether that's in our economy, I think it's really taken root throughout the world. So you have this huge shift in, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. No, you go.
I was going to say, so you have this shift in the incentive structure, and you have state actors and non-state actors that are making very rational choices in that incentive structure. And so they're looking at war as a very legitimate means in their eyes for territorial conquest, for economic leverage and resources, for political power. They're trying to reshape their country's internal politics by fighting civil wars. And there are lots of sellers of weapons and tools available to them, including a lot of these emerging technologies. And the increasing use of drones and AI-powered targeting systems has totally transformed what warfare looks like today. Ukraine is a great example of that, where we've seen Ukraine take on a much more powerful military actor in Russia, in part by using drone technologies. These drones that are interceptor drones that cost $2,000, $3,000, right? They're very cheap pieces of technology that can really close the power gap with Russia. We also see that in the war that Iran has been fighting with the United States, where Iran is, deploying these Shahed, drones that are $40,000, $50,000, and the United States is trying to shoot them down with $4 million Patriot missiles. Right, that this sort of cost benefit is totally warped, and so Iran has really been able to close that power gap in quite a way. So you have that sort of shrinking of the power gap on one side, and on the state side, you have this increasing use of AI-based targeting systems that can. For the United States, the United States is targeting 10 times as many people as it was able to in the past because of the speed with which AI can produce those targets. And while a human is in the loop, the human is basically gets, some of the Israeli reporting around the use of the lavender system in Gaza. The human's getting like 20 seconds to verify whether or not this is a legitimate target. It is not enough time to provide some accountability on these systems. And so that increases speed, plus the shrinking of the sort of gap between the large military actors and the capacity they're able to bring versus these very low-cost alternatives. That combination of drones and AI have been really powerful together. And then the big question becomes, what happens when more non-state actors get their hands on it, which has already become a huge issue in Africa? And what happens when you start combining drones plus AI and you start having AI-enabled swarms of drones that can be piloted by one person, where one person can pilot 50, 100, 1,000 drones versus one-to-one operator to unit. So those things have really changed warfare in the past few years that we've seen.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating in terms of, again, Ukraine as an example. It's completely changed the battlefield in terms of, we see all these drone lines going over, and then the local citizens will generally have the tarps to try and cover to, limit potential impacts from the drones on civilian populations. And then there are the videos also. I'm not sure if you've seen them. I don't recommend seeking them out, but, of the drone operators finding the humans, and you see either the Russian or Ukrainian soldier, vice versa, before they're taken out. But I'm glad that you took a step back. You're very great at providing context. So I do want to focus a little more on that before we move forward. I'm curious. We have this asymmetry that's evolved, obviously exacerbating not only the ability to wield power, but then these shifts in power and the, deviation from norms that we've had. I'm wondering if you could take us a little bit more into, what do you think got us here? Because, like you said, we are kind of in the space of, quote unquote, rules are for suckers, whether this is state or non-state actors. And it's a bit of perhaps a more blatant approach to wielding power, warfare, so forth, so on. So wondering if you could talk more about what got us here, in your opinion.
Yeah, part of it is, and again, I think a lot about the era in which the internet was built and regulated, right? This period of the 90s of consolidation. This was that Francis Fukuyama end of history narrative of economic liberalization, political liberalization, and improved daily living. We're all going to work in tandem together. So there's a real confidence and optimism. The world was all moving together. that we had a shared stake together, that there were going to be just less friction between countries because everyone's going to become liberal democracies soon enough. Everyone's going to become free market capitalists and free trade capitalists soon enough. And so there's a real emphasis on let's cooperate to resolve these issues and that we can work together to find some sort of international set of standards and rules that we can work together on. I think post 2008 financial crisis, post Brexit, post Trump, but then also some of the political shifts we've seen, for instance, in China with Xi Jinping versus Hu Jintao. I mean, we've seen not just in the US, and I really don't want to make this a story exclusively about the US because it is also about Europe. It's also about China. There's been this huge international shift in mindset towards we don't believe that the international system is capable of solving these major global problems. We have these globalized risks, but we still have these very local solutions to them. We don't feel that the international system is creating accountability for the most powerful actors. That was sort of the promise of the liberal international order, the US-led international order post-World War II was the United States is the most powerful military, political, economic actor in the world, and we're going to restrain our own power within this rules framework. And the rules benefited the United States, but the premise was for other countries was buy into the system where the most powerful actor will restrain its own power versus having it unleashed. And I think, what a lot of the Trump approach has been, let's not defend the system that binds the United States in. Let's sort of unleash our power and not have these rules bind us in. But, so much of the international economic system was built around this idea of entrapment, right? Countries get a good economic deal for participating in a US-led economic system of dollarization and all the financial transactions going through New York. Once you start weaponizing that system against countries are going to start feeling, well, we're not really getting a great part of this deal. And it's not just the Chinas and Irans of the world, it's Canada, it's the UK, right? It's countries that should be the most closely aligned with the United States are saying, we're not sure if this system really benefits us anymore. We're not sure if we get a good deal anymore. And so countries start exiting that. And I think that there's a real parallel to what we're seeing on AI today where, the United States is in many ways trying to entrap countries within its economic models in the same way, right? In the same way it's did within its economic system. But it's also simultaneously trying to use whatever economic choke points it has, whether that's semiconductors, whether that's frontier models, to use that as economic leverage and weaponization against other countries. And you can't really do both at the same time. You can't entrap while you weaponize. And so I think there's the gap there. I think that there's also an interesting parallel to what we saw on climate change. Climate change is a really interesting kind of example to compare to AI development of, again, you had this really strong period on climate change where international cooperation was the dominant mindset, basically from the Kyoto Protocol in the 90s through the Paris Agreement in 2015 of this is a shared existential crisis. We can't resolve it ourselves. We all have to work together. We all need to kind of commit together to some international agreement that we're going to fight this. And that was really helpful in establishing international legitimacy, to creating some level of accountability, but it didn't necessarily create the incentive structure to spur this sort of private sector investment and innovation we needed to really solve the climate crisis. Post-Trump removing the United States from the Paris Agreement, both Trump and the Biden administration, but also Xi Jinping in China and a lot of the EU started really adopting this competition mindset on climate change. This is a competition over who's going to own and win the kind of green economy. And so we need to compete our way out of the climate crisis. And that has been really powerful and effective for spurring innovation on the climate sector, reducing costs of solar panels and wind turbines and things like that. It's really, really valuable on a lot of the climate mitigation goals. But that incentive structure has left behind a lot of these human security issues of climate change. I used to do a lot of advocacy on behalf of climate vulnerable countries that were also affected by conflict. And those communities are the ones that are really getting left behind. Climate adaptation, a lot of the kind of climate justice initiatives, those are the things that get left behind from a competition mindset. AI has sort of entered into this competition mindset already versus a cooperation mindset. And so, again, I think we're going to see the same sort of thing. Huge investments, incredible innovation at a speed with which a cooperation mindset probably would not have been able to build. But again, really deprioritizing and disincentivizing any work on the human security aspects and sort of what does this mean for the most vulnerable people?
I have so many questions. Talking with you is always very compelling. So we can delve into a lot of things. I think before we do that, I want to take it down even to an individual level. just to kind of understand your approach, whether it's how you work with clients, teaching students, and then your just view of the world. So I remember when I was at SC, I took this like game theory class essentially, and it was interesting to see the different breakout segments with each individual TA because each TA kind of had their own view of the world. And you saw that play out in the way that the class played the game, whether it was consciously or subconsciously. So I'm wondering, you're very well spoken on all these points, but I'm curious in terms of international relations theory, in terms of approaches to the world, what do you generally subscribe to as a lens for how you understand the world? Just so that some of our listeners can understand. I mean, it's helpful.
Yeah, it's funny. I spend a lot of my day explaining complicated things to people. As a consultant said, I'm explaining technical policy issues to members of Congress and to CEOs. As a professor, I'm explaining international relations theory to my students. I'm a parent to a young kid, so I spend a lot of my day in car rides answering my 5-year-old's questions and explaining complicated things about the world. I believe very strongly that information is a source of power, and explaining things is how you share and distribute that power. And that we see in a lot of sectors this real emphasis on stovepiping and gatekeeping and hiding behind technical complexity, which all these things are incredibly technically complex. That frontier AI models are incredibly technically complex. Climate scientists, that is very technically complex. What's happening in conflict zones is very technically complex. That is not an excuse to try to shut non-experts out. And the only way you actually solve any of these complex policy issues where you can incorporate, for instance, on AI, right? What does that mean for national security? What does that mean for workers? What does that mean for the kind of macroeconomic situation? What does that mean for interpersonal relationships? What does that mean from an ethics basis? A technical expert cannot possibly be expected to solve all those issues or think about all those issues. You need to be able to bring in people from different backgrounds and expertise together to try to approach something from different angles. And I think that on every policy issue, we get the best results when we have a much more diverse group of experts coming together and approaching things from different perspectives. That is only possible when you are able to explain things in a clear way to non-experts and to explain things in ways that other people can understand. And I think it's one of the challenges, if you're a policymaker in government right now, your ability to understand what is happening with these emerging technologies. These changes are moving way faster than the institutions are able to keep up with. And so their ability to regulate it, to identify kind of what the key gaps and loopholes, and identify and understand where the private sector, tech companies' incentives may differ from the national government's incentives. Those things are really hard when you just cannot understand what is being presented in front of you. And so I think that's maybe kind of an overarching philosophy I have, that we need to really fight to explain technical complexity so that we can bring more people into the conversation, so we can actually have a kind of 360 view of any policy issue.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, even just seeing some of your work, you're very good at visualizing things. And there is definitely a gap or a need for a bridge, whether it be between private sector, international stakeholders, because we're all speaking very different languages. And then with these technical topics, a lot of nuance is lost. So definitely appreciate your approach there. Now, I want to touch on the point that you brought up about, you mentioned essentially how we have these more emergence of kind of a multilateral geopolitical competition with a variety of different stakeholders. I've always been fascinated with structures, systems, and the US has done a quite good job of this after post-World War II in terms of setting up Bretton Woods system, having those financial structures, incentives. I saw someone else, Damien Ma from, I think he's at Asia Group right now. I need to double check, but he posted the other day that in a quote unquote US-led world, like you were mentioning with the promise of liberalism, democracy with the 90s, so forth, so on, it was the promise of the idea of security that the US offered was kind of a hard security protection of the world as long as you bought into its economic systems, whereas the one China's offering is much more transactional right now. And he just posted that as a US-China expert. I think that it extends beyond just the US and China, like you said, because we see a lot of these different interactions going on. But then that also introduces the idea of what is sovereignty when we have leverage and we're talking about AI managing national security, economy, so forth, so on. You brought up Canada. So I think this might be an interesting place if you're able to talk to it about your views on sovereignty moving forward, because this has been challenged, whether it be in the climate realm, emerging technologies. What are your views on that right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the defining sovereignty and what does sovereignty mean, norms around sovereignty are also one of the things that are really shifting right now
Mhm.
around the world. And again, that's not about AI, but AI and these emerging technologies are transforming that conversation as well. Um, so sovereignty is, national sovereignty and the sort of sovereignty of the nation state is just the fundamental bedrock principle of the modern international system, right? The nation state is the unit of measurement we use. And so the protection of the nation state and the rights of that nation state are paramount in the international system. Now, that leaves out really important, multinational corporations that have, or businesses much larger than many national GDPs. That leaves out a lot of the population that's not represented by their nation state's government. That leaves out civil society, like where I used to work. That leaves out a whole suite of actors, right? So we can have a conversation about is that is prioritizing the nation state right, but this fundamental bedrock principle is under challenge in a lot of ways, and I think one of the parts we see that in the international system is this. Um, the Trump administration has really moved away from, again, the rules-based order was in part based around states interact with one another on an equal basis. Now, obviously, not really equal, power still exists, but within the international system, there is an assumption of, one vote, a similar vote, some semblance of equality. Now, this is much more that sort of old kind of, imperial mindset of, I have a sphere of influence that I control and I get to figure out as a great power what I do with it. You have your sphere of influence that you get to control, right? That's not nations working together on an equal basis. And then what I think is really interesting is the role of AI in so many of this, right? We have what Chatham House has termed, patriotic tech. This idea of, let's have, our country only use the kind of frontier models from our country because we don't want to be reliant on other countries. And I think for a lot of countries, that really got taken to a head in June when, the Trump administration basically ordered the kind of switching off of two different, by administrative order, two different frontier models from the United States, right? And so if you're in Europe, you're still at the behest of what the United States government is deciding. You're still at the behest of what other governments are doing. I think this is a really interesting part of this sort of U.S. approach of let's create these more closed systems where you have this kill switch, you have a lot more control, but again, it's trying to entrap people within this sort of broader U.S. technology ecosystem versus China's more open source approach, which I think is probably very attractive to a lot of countries that don't feel comfortable being entrapped in a U.S. technological ecosystem. An open source approach also creates huge proliferation challenges, particularly once you start thinking about what does that mean when non-state actors start getting access to these things. But again, but technology is a critical part of sovereignty, like you said. I mean, when the war in Ukraine started, right? You think about all the cloud-based systems that the Ukrainian government depended on, right? Like its ability to stay alive depended on whether or not these private sector companies were going to cooperate with the government, whether it was going to facilitate and, Amazon's or AWS, Microsoft for a lot of its cloud computing services. A lot of these private sector companies did work really closely with the Ukrainian government, help keep that government alive at this really critical moment. Other governments are not going to be as lucky as the Ukrainian government or not have the same relationships that the Ukrainian government had with these companies. And so there is a real risk of this real two-tier sovereignty of like who has access to these frontier systems, who has the computing power, who has the cloud-based services, and who is sort of on the outside looking in. I think one of the most interesting things to me is, again, you look at somewhere like Africa, where the African Union's continental AI strategy has already really flagged autonomous weapons in particular as becoming this huge problem across the continent. Non-state actors getting control of it. This $1 billion import market of automated systems. The African countries and the African Union have no seat at the table in any of these conversations, right? So again, who's being the most affected by it? Who actually has a seat at the table? And there's just a total mismatch between them.
Yeah, I mean, I'd really love to hear more about specifically Africa. Africa is a continent where I've had some work specifically more in the northern region, but overall, it's not my area of expertise. I think we focus a lot on Ukraine, obviously, around Israel right now. But I was speaking with a researcher at MIT, also working on essentially globalizing access to AI, so forth, so on. But beyond even that level, if we're talking at, AI, autonomous weapons, so forth, so on, that is very attractive to non-state actors as well as governments. And for people that are perhaps not having a seat at the table, it's an easy way to access power. There's so many different ways that we could jump into the conversation, trying to word it, but I'm curious if you could talk more about that because it's not my area of expertise. And as someone who teaches and as someone with a consulting firm, you also have huge expertise in this area of conflict that I think would be really helpful for listeners.
Yeah. I think first and foremost, one of the things to really understand about conflict, when you tell someone, all right, think about conflict, think of a war. The first thing that pops in their mind is US, Iran, Russia, Ukraine, right? A war between two states, interstate war. That is actually a fairly small part of what war looks like today. If you look at most conflicts today, they are not wars between states. They are wars within states. They are civil wars, interstate conflicts. And the biggest, and again, when you think about what an interstate war looks like, a civil war, that's a war that basically says our political system cannot distribute economic, political, social resources in a way that is satisfying to all the members of that. And they are looking for means outside of politics to fight for greater political economic stakes in the country, right? So war is trying to solve a political question, which is very, very difficult to do. Second, when you look at interstate war, the fastest growing category of interstate war is internationalized interstate war. So civil wars where other countries are playing a very large role. So Sudan is a great example. Sudan is probably the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world right now. Sudan is a civil war between two factions of the military fighting with one another, but it's got a huge suite of external actors that are looking for influence, looking to shape who's going to be in charge, looking to make a dollar off the conflict and other people suffering. The UAE really at the head of that list. And so when international actors get involved in conflicts, those conflicts get longer, they get harder to resolve, they get a lot deadlier, right? Because international actors bring more money, more guns, more bombs, more sophisticated weaponry. We see this in Sudan, for instance, right? They're ACLED, which is one of the kind of premier organizations that studies conflict around the world. They basically logged one drone strike every day in Sudan over a course of a 3-year span, right? So we've seen this huge increase there. This is part of a broader trend we see around the world. There, basically, over the course of the last 3 years, we've seen this, I think it's like a 1,500% increase in drone use by non-state actors, right? So drones are not just a story for state actors. They're increasingly becoming a story for non-state actors, and AI use and AI targeting is absolutely going to be sort of the new realm for non-state actors as well. And so for countries in Africa, and again, if you look at, for instance, the International Rescue Committee's emergency watch list, which looks at sort of what are the biggest crises around the world, 8 of their 10 biggest humanitarian crises are in Africa. And these crises, when you look at them, tend to have a common pattern, which is they are sitting at the intersection of 3 separate crises. One is there's conflict and instability and violence. 2 is they are some of the most climate vulnerable countries on the planet. If you look at that Venn diagram of what are the most climate vulnerable countries and what are the most conflict affected countries, that Venn diagram is becoming a circle. And 3rd, these are some of the most countries with the highest levels of extreme poverty on the planet, in part because climate change and climate crisis fuels poverty, conflict fuels poverty, and both those things make it really hard to fight extreme poverty within your country, right? So this Venn diagram of extreme poverty, climate vulnerability, and conflict are all coming together, particularly in a lot of African communities. It makes it very hard for them to build resilience against any of these things. And finally, when you think about what conflicts look like, and this is, particularly for civil wars and particularly in Africa, we tend to assume conflict is this on-off switch of 1 or 0. Countries are at war or they're not. Most conflicts today, sort of, if you think about sort of whatever your timeline chart is, if this is the sort of violence level required to consider something a war, right? It usually have 1,000 fatalities a year or something like that. Countries are not going to war and then going to peace. They're sort of bubbling right below that level, some violence that is not quite at the level of war, and then something explodes where they're at above that level, and then things kind of quiet down. They never really get to peace, but they dip below that violence threshold where they're not at peace, but they're not really at war. And this will continue on in various cycles for years, if not decades, fueled by external intervention, fueled by the lack of resolution to a lot of these really fundamentally political and economic challenges within countries. And again, when you reduce the barriers to war, when you reduce the cost to war, it only incentivizes people to say like, well, if I'm not getting what I want from a country's political system, let's find means outside of politics to try to get some of those same needs.
Yeah, I remember when I was walking through the streets of Colombia, which has, a history of internal conflict. My family was nervous for me going there, but I mean, right now it's actually pretty settled and okay overall. But just walking past the playgrounds, understanding that these were the scenes of atrocities was shocking, but that's still very real and present in many parts of the world today. I think before moving on, I'm wondering, can you talk a bit more about what climate vulnerability means, entails, and its impact? Because I think it's a conversation that's becoming more lost now as we focus kind of more on these hard power, I guess, levers.
Yeah. The way that I explain to my students the relationship between climate change and climate vulnerability and fragility and conflict. Um, I think there was a period of time where people were starting to sound the alarm of climate change and conflict. There's this relationship here. And you got these very simplistic explanations of climate change equal drives natural resource competition, and that gets you conflict, or climate change caused ISIS. That's a very oversimplified explanation. I tend to think of instead about boiling a pot of water. So if you have a pot of water and you take climate change, which is a lid that you put on top of that pot of water, if you don't have the burner on and you put a lid on top of a pot of water, it's not going to make the water boil. But if you have a raging fire underneath that pot of water and you put a lid on, you add a lot more pressure and that pot of water is going to boil over. That's the sort of effect that climate change is having on fragile and conflict affected states. It is not causing conflict, but it is putting a lot more pressure on existing fractures economically, socially, politically within countries. And so what that means is that countries that already have these deep cleavages in their politics around ethnic, tribal, religious tensions, or because of the sort of winners and losers within the economy, of a particular country, or who has political power, who doesn't. When you start adding the effects of climate change, what happens when a certain community's resources, growing agriculture, are affected? What happens when certain people from one region have to migrate to a different region because their area is no longer habitable? That's really what produces the conflict. And so we've seen that in Syria, we see that in places like Nigeria, we see that all over the world. And so, again, if you're a stable and wealthy country, you can largely invest in ways to build resilience against climate changes, right? You can rebuild cities, you can help, migrate people in a more comfortable way. You can, build insurance systems, right? If you are in a place with high levels of extreme poverty, and you're in a place that's already fragile, or conflict affected, it's very hard to build any sort of resilience. And we see this particularly in agricultural communities. I worked with the International Rescue Committee to support a lot of farmers in conflict affected countries. And, for a lot of communities, when your primary source of income, your livelihood comes from what you grow in the ground, and that is being affected by droughts, by changes in precipitation and temperature, all of a sudden your economic livelihood is up for grabs. And you become either more vulnerable to terrorist groups and gangs that are trying to recruit you, or you become, more radicalized, or you have to move to a place where you have less of an economic, less of a sort of support system, right? We saw this in Syria in the mid 2000s. A huge drought hit a lot of the agriculturally productive parts of the country. And a lot of families started sending, the eldest son from the family to go into the city to work a job to supplement some income because we were just not making enough. And a lot of those individuals that moved to cities became, critical parts of the base for what became, the Arab uprising there, and eventually the Free Syrian Army and the war there. So it has this real knock-on effect, and we see this again, this increasing overlap between the most climate vulnerable and the most conflict affected places around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pull a thread out. So you mentioned radicalization, and then we have these individuals moving to different spaces, whether they be impacted by climate change or emerging technology. I think this is a common thread that we see in radicalization of disenfranchised groups around the world, creating kind of an asymmetry of power, as well as just, again, disenfranchisement and feeling the lack of it, which leads to these issues. And we see this, like you said, in Africa, it's very pertinent. We see it, depending on the narrative you want to spin, potentially in the States with very, very far right populist movements. And that's not to, add any moralization to it. It's just looking at how the system works. But I think also it highlights a difference in approach to these issues by different parts of the world. I mean, we have kind of the US-led approach, the EU approach, as well as Asia, kind of more Chinese approach in terms of how to handle these issues. I'm wondering, as we see these different things, we have the disenfranchised groups, but then there's, like you mentioned before, the people that stand to profit from this. I'm wondering if we can swivel a bit to that point in terms of who you see leading the power dynamics in the world right now, who we need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think one of the most sort of interesting trends in conflict that has happened, and this again comes from a lot of the colleagues I work at, the kind of frontline humanitarian workers that are seeing conflicts happen on an everyday basis. Conflict economies, people making money off of conflict, is existed as long as conflict has, right? That's always been a part of conflicts. What has changed is that conflict economies have become this global, multi-billion dollar industry with a lot of buyers and sellers, right? You can buy arms on a global market, not just from your neighbor next door. You can sell the resources that you extract, whether it's through the extortion of a local population, or if you're in the DRC and you control a mining town, you can smuggle gold and, smuggle, minerals out and sell them on the black market, right? There's just a lot more profit. There's a lot more buyers and sellers. And again, this international system that has many more geopolitical actors trying to exert their influence, trying to compete, there just means that there's just so many more buyers and sellers. And the marketplace has really incentivized and made profitable these conflict economies. So you have all these different people that are making money off of different parts of the conflict economies. And I think that this is where two things come to mind. One, on an international basis, the international system built post-World War II was so focused on how do you prevent wars between states? How do you address the decision-making of states at war? That is not really the vector of conflict right now, right? So the vector of conflict is not necessarily states deciding to go to war and whether or not you can get the head of state to end the war. It's many different groups where you're in a conflict zone where there's 10 different rebel groups, right? How do you get a peace deal between the government and its various militias and 10 different rebel groups that are all backed by different international players, right? That's a much more complicated scenario. So I think a lot of the tools of peacemaking and diplomacy sort of break down that context. I think a lot of our ability to affect the incentive structure of conflict actors is really weak, right? In particular around conflict economies. And it's, I think one of the things that's concerning for me is that involvement in conflict economies is not for, the black market and sort of, the people on the fringes of respectable society. It's like countries like the United States or the UAE, as government policy, trying to figure out, like, how do I make a dollar off this conflict, right? The United States' involvement in a peace deal in the Eastern DRC was predicated in large part on the United States getting access to certain critical minerals that are there, right? It's the United States trying to profit in a way off of this conflict, right? And we see this, and again, that's not to say that's exclusive to the United States. That's something we see in countries around the world of how do you, as part of national policy, profit off of these conflicts. And then finally, one of the reasons, one of the key takeaways I had, we work in DC. I spent a lot of time working in the sort of national security foreign policy establishment in DC. And one of the disappointments I really had from that whole sector is how much focus it's spent on nation states and trying to understand nation states as individual rational actors versus the component parts of people, right? And people have a very different incentive structure. They have very different motivations than a state does. And one of the reasons that I like working in the humanitarian sector for so long is that it was so people-centric. And one of the things you see over and over again, I've been to conflict zones in Iraq and El Salvador and the DRC and Nigeria, and you talk to people and people are looking for dignity. They are looking for the ability to have some sense of control and autonomy over their life. And they're looking for some level of investment in the future, particularly for their kids. When those things start breaking down, right, their willingness to abide by the political structures and rules, the norms around use of violence, like those things start breaking down very fast. And I think all these trends are feeding into removing dignity from people, removing autonomy and control over people's lives, removing people's investment in the future. I think that that's a very scary thing because, those ingredients for people sort of not having a stake in the future and sort of being more nihilistic about it. I mean, those things are all getting supercharged by the choices that are being made by governments and tech companies, and venture capitalists around the world right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating because we have this kind of first it starts as ennui, and then there's disillusionment, and then we get to this more nihilistic approach where people don't want to, you know, necessarily follow these norms because there is no clear future of hope. We see this in many different societies across the world. I think that, again, fascinating, but I want to turn the conversation to what it could look like for productive governance or engagement of stakeholders in this place. I think that we've seen different approaches across different nation states, as well as, I mean, even if we're talking about multinational corporations, what that looks like in terms of engaging with your population, because multinational corporations have workforce programs, support for them, so forth, so on. So it's just interesting the different power that these larger actors hold. I think that when we're talking about governance, when these issues arise, what are you seeing in terms of approaches? I remember in the notes that you sent over, you were talking about the UK government and some interesting things going on there.
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, governments need to understand what they're trying to manage and regulate. You can't either effectively regulate something or manage it or deploy it and support and invest in it if you don't understand what you're building. And I think that far too many policymakers, and in particular, far too many legislators that are elected, do not have a requisite baseline understanding of what these technologies are. And part of that is that it's hard to understand. These things are changing really rapidly, changing faster than, we even saw with the internet. Part of it is that, again, compared to the internet, the government was doing a lot of the initial funding for universities that were doing this research. And so a lot of that kind of core expertise was in a small number of universities tied to the government. And now it's all in private labs where the government is trying to play catch up, is trying to sort of ask for the ability for people, for them to get explained to. And I think it means that many policymakers and legislators get stuck in this place where they are much more vulnerable to the most extreme versions of rhetoric about what this technology is going to be, whether it's the most optimistic version or the most nihilistic, pessimistic version. I think people are much more vulnerable to that when you don't really understand what it is you're trying to regulate and address. Again, we see this not just in the United States, we see this around the world. Elected legislators have a really hard time keeping up with these changes. In the UK, the House of Commons, which is the elected lower house, having a very difficult time. One of the things that the UK has done with their political system is that the House of Lords, which has many more appointees, they started appointing into the peerage system members of the House of Lords that have a technical background in these areas to help legislators fight back and understand what they're regulating, help explain to other legislators, what we're trying to address, and can talk to these tech companies on a more equal footing. And I think that's really important. In the United States, I think we've lost a lot of government capacity for understanding emerging technologies. The Office of Technological Assessment, which is sort of the main congressionally backed body for this, it got shut down in 1995 when Netscape launched. Right, so there's been this huge shift since then, and I understand there's still the Office of Science and Technology Policy within the executive branch, but Congress has lost a lot of its ability to understand these things. You compound that with a huge problem of gerontocracy that we have in the United States, and other countries like China have this as well. But gerontocracy is not helping this problem. When I worked in DC around that period where drones and cyber attacks were becoming more of the kind of common part of what warfare looked like, the most senior members of the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense that were in charge of making these decisions, I would engage with them, and they either didn't have personal emails, or if they did have a personal email, it was an AOL account, which I think speaks to their age and their relationship with technology. That is very hard to effectively manage, to control the system, right? This is going back to the Strom Thurmond, comment about the internet being a series of tubes, right? Like this total disconnect in understanding. So I think that's a big part of it, that we need sort of better information getting to legislators. We need the government to rebuild its ability to understand things independently versus relying on, the government affairs capacity of OpenAIs or other lobbyists that are coming to them trying to tell them a particular thing. So I think that's one piece of it. I think the other piece is how do you build some guardrails without expecting that we're going to move back to a world of cooperation mindset, or that you're going to significantly be able to slow down development, right? But how do you build some guardrails? I think the purchasing power for countries is a really important part of that. I think can you create some like very clear technical expectations for suppliers on traceability, reliability, bias mitigation, et cetera, right? There's important procurement piece powers that the government has. I think some of the incident reporting and independent verification organizations around transparency is really important. One of the things just coming over from the conflict space, impunity and abuses of power thrive in darkness. And so a UN report showing, detailing atrocities and trying to improve transparency in good investigative journalism, it's not going to stop abuses of power, but it shines a light and sort of helps civil society and others figure out kind of where to focus their attention. We just need more transparency in this space. And lastly, I do think that there needs to be some sort of investment in the more human security elements of these emerging technologies, particularly for the most vulnerable communities around the world, which tend to be in conflict and crisis zones, extremely poor places, climate vulnerable places. We need some sort of much more specific focus there versus exclusively focused on what does this mean for speeding up our targeting capacity for our military.
I mean, I think it's interesting when we talk about these issues and also the pursuit of power, specifically with talking about human security. I know that some work that I've done with organizations, it's if the government doesn't have the capacity to build up infrastructure or provide certain services, private companies, multinational companies will come in where they have strategic business objectives. And then that creates, an interesting incentive for either support or lack of support there, whether there is conflict or not, if there's any quote unquote payoff in the region. And I think there has been a loss on the focus of human security, partially with, using the US as an example, all of these foreign conflicts going on and the distractions that provides compared to, say, domestic issues. This also happens in other countries as well. But then I think another interesting trend that I've seen is obviously multinational companies are not nation states, but they do wield a lot of power. And I think it's been interesting to see how they can wield that internationally, as well as if we look specifically at the technology sphere, is kind of, I don't know if you ever read this piece by The Atlantic, it's the rise of kind of techno-authoritarianism, which I thought was a very interesting piece. I spent a little bit of time, most of my work has been kind of more on the government side of things. I've spent some time on the tech side as well as crypto, finance, so forth, so on. And when you get into the psyche of the people operating at this levels, it's very individualistic, which is great for, moving fast and breaking things, but at what cost? So there is the human element there that is left. And then when we talk about issues like climate change and the fallout from that, governments are struggling to deal with this. But say in the United States or European Western countries where we don't necessarily have the prerequisite for these companies to align with government interests, that can create conflict of interests where perhaps they pursue revenue growth, technology adoption, so forth, so on. And the people leading these companies often, there are some of those pieces where they go off in the desert, they have their meeting and they talk about what they're going to do during the global apocalypse after, climate change and how they'll escape it, essentially leaving everyone else for naught. So, I do have a lot of empathy for policymakers that are struggling with these issues. And I think it's interesting, A, the gap in incentives, and then B, the gap in communication. I think Anthropic just came to Congress to provide some testimony. And with that in mind, Anthropic sent a lower level, more technical focused analyst, which was great in terms of providing technology, but he wasn't able to speak to the policy side of things, which the government, the policymakers were more interested in. So at the same time, we do have, like you said, these organizations creating global affairs groups, policy, governance, analysis. So there is some interest within these groups, but then it is, of course, pushing for more of the companies' interests and then bringing that to the government. We saw this with NVIDIA and kind of the back and forth and tension of, will we export these chips? Will we not? And then they'll find workarounds and then they'll advocate and lobby. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just inherent to the interest. But with that in mind, I think one thing that I've been playing with is not just this oversaturation of information that both policymakers as well as business leaders are having, But how do you feel about political or social will right now? Because I feel like I just haven't noticed it as much at the higher level conversations.
Yeah, um, one of the biggest shifts again that these emerging technologies are kind of coming into context in is this breakdown of the feedback loop between the nation state, the government, and the people it's governing. Um, and I think we see that sort of in the context of the tech companies where, like, obviously, since Citizens United in the United States in particular, the role of money in elections has increased, the role of corporations and companies has increased. And so increasingly, because of the way our political system functions, policymakers and government, politicians, they are more accountable to the money that is required to run their campaign versus the people that are voting for them. And so that warps their incentives. And then you think about the massive growth and the amount of money available to these tech companies that have a very strong interest in how the government does or does not regulate these policies. The way they've been sort of encouraged to, really, step up their lobbying. We've seen, Meta in particular, but also, OpenAI and others really ramp up their government advocacy work. It's really noticeable. I mean, one of the things that's striking to me is seeing the way that tech companies have become the new defense contractors, not just, both figuratively and literally, right? Literally in the sense that they're getting defense contracts, but figuratively in the sense that, when you were in DC and, when I was in DC, my whole professional network that like worked at DoD or National Security Council or State Department or congressional offices, when it was time for them to leave government and cash out, they all went to Raytheon or Boeing or Lockheed Martin, the people that made defense instruments that had a lot of money because they could recruit those people. My entire professional network now works at OpenAI and Anthropic and all these tech companies because that's who has money. That's who's able to pull the best and brightest minds from government. And so the government is really, again, at this huge deficit, right? The talent deficit in particular. And again, just looking at kind of what other countries have done, the UK actually ended up, one of the sort of key kind of AI agencies, they sort of had to they sort of asked for a permit to basically remove some of these salary caps for civil service, specifically so that they could actually compete on salary levels with what tech sector was providing. So they could actually recruit back into government some of the best and brightest minds. So there's this huge gap there. I think also just your point about incentives and overlap between free. When I think about this a lot, I was working, I was at a conference where we're talking quite a bit around the kind of geopolitics of these emerging technologies. And one of the kind of leading set of some of the leading experts on AI in the context of US-China competition really framed the story as the United States needs to win this race. It is absolutely essential the United States win this race because of X, Y, and Z reasons why we don't trust the Chinese government and we don't trust what they build, blah, blah, blah. And the assumption was that what is in the interest of the US private sector, and by that I mostly mean multinational corporations, what is in the interest of the US government and what is in the interest of the US people is pretty well aligned and very different from what is in the interest of this alignment of Chinese private interests, Chinese government, Chinese citizens. And my counter argument was like, I actually don't think that's true. I think that the average consumer and worker in China have a lot more in common in their interests with the average worker and consumer in the United States in terms of how they interact with these technologies. And that maybe the private sector and the government have a lot of interest aligned, but that is not to say it's in the national interest of what it means for the population, right? And I think we certainly see that in the way that the Trump administration is approaching a lot of these changes. And so I think just even being conscious of their different incentives and being very aware of like, when are you substituting your incentive for my incentive is very important. I think that this piece around incentives and what you do, I think it's a big part of the reason that there's been such an emphasis of tech companies on hiring storytelling because they need people to explain what they're building. And those technical experts are not, they have a lot of skills, and one of them is not storytelling, right? So they need people that can put into context what we're seeing and explain it in a way that sort of pull people towards their incentives. So I think that's been a really interesting shift. And the last thing, you talked about techno-authoritarianism and just more broadly around state capacity. Look, a lot of people their interaction with AI is going to be ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, but moving forward, I think the biggest interaction people are going to have with AI is the state's administrative capacity, right? It's on tax collection, on surveillance, on benefits allocation, on regulatory enforcement, right? On deciding, who gets what benefits. Like that stuff is where a lot of governments are moving towards AI. And if you think about a lot of countries in the global south that have weak capacity, right? They need way more administrative capacity than they have. A country like the DRC does not have effective state capacity in like half of the country because it's conflict affected and it's being overrun by Rwandan-backed rebels, right? So these countries need an expansion of administrative power, but that is a dangerous thing as well because you have authoritarian countries that are going to see this opportunity to dramatically expand its surveillance capabilities, its ability to target dissidents. It's this administrative power can be used in very dangerous ways as well. And so again, I just think about we just need to think holistically about these things. And that's why it's important to have so many different actors at the table together that have a baseline understanding of these issues and the ability, the work that you're doing and others are doing to try to help explain what is going on, help connect the dots between different sectors that are grappling with these things is just absolutely essential right now because there's no individual sector, specifically not the people that are building it, that understand the implications and ramifications of it.
Exactly. Excuse me. I think I have 2 or 3 more questions if you have some time. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
for sure. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So I think just real quick touching on it, I mean, this is a little bit of a different issue than conflict, but I think given your experience working across lots of strata, dealing with different actors and lots of different issues, I think it would be just an interesting thought exercise. So right now, I mean, specifically with governance, state capacity, federal capacity, I think one of the interesting things that's emerging is the discussion between state level versus federal level policy on AI in the United States. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your view of that, because there's many different voices, many different interests here.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a huge challenge,
Yeah.
right? What we're missing, right, is any sort of sense of, kind of global approach or a sort of consolidated set of we've some level of agreement across a global institution. We're not going to get that anytime soon. Again, the incentive structure of, the international system right now really discourages those sorts of, global treaties, any sort of kind of global set of standards, right? This is not the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty after the birth of the atomic bomb. This is not the Chemical Weapons Convention after the use of chemical weapons in World War I, right? We're in a totally different era where it's going to be very hard to build that consensus. And so you have this sort of grab bag of national policies, right? Where the EU is so radically different from where the United States is right now. Now, a million different pieces of legislation at the state and local level is going to be a nightmare too, right? Because how can you as a private sector company engage across that many different standards? And I think like we saw on auto standards and sort of, fuel efficiency standards, what ends up happening is whoever has the sort of most market power can ship that. And that's why California played such a critical role in driving fuel efficiency on autos is they just had such an outsized role to play in who buys autos. I don't necessarily know if you get the same sort of market capacity by any state or local actor right in that same way. Who's buying enough to really be able to sort of ship things. And again, I think it's a really difficult environment if you're a private sector company trying to figure out how to navigate these things. So you do need some national and ideally global leadership. So you have, again, some clarity, some consistency, some certainty if you are a worker, if you are a consumer, if you are government, if you are private sector, right? That's what everyone's looking for. The generally thing that I've seen from governments, from civil society actors, and from private sector is they can navigate quite a wide range of different regulatory environments. High regulatory environment, low regulatory environment. What they can't tolerate is the inconsistency and unpredictability. And I think right now, again, the international system has really incentivized this very unpredictable nature. We've sort of lost a lot of those set of assumptions of these are the rules that everyone's going to follow. There's so much unpredictability. It, reduces the willingness of people to invest. It reduces the willingness of people to take risks. And so I think that inconsistency, lack of clarity, lack of certainty is strangling a lot of growth and prosperity. And so that's what we're trying to get to. It's less about you need this really sort of EU-style high standard, or you need this more laissez-faire approach that really drives innovation. But you just need some level of consistency, clarity, and certainty that everyone can work off of from there. And everyone understands what the rules are, what the incentives are. And unfortunately, that's hard to come by in a context where people think that the rules are for suckers.
Yeah. So that is the operating environment right now, unfortunately. But With that in mind, I mean, that's just the reality of things. So, in order to have kind of a productive conversation moving forward, we have this maelstrom of issues, whether it be for business or for policymakers. What are what's either the one biggest point or three bullet points in terms of what would you recommend that people focus on to productively move forward on these issues? I mean, what's your recommendation or
Yeah, I mean, a few different things. One, you know, to me, from a like institutional perspective, I think rebuilding the government's independent capacity to understand emerging technologies. You have that in government scattered in different places, right? OSTP in the executive branch, you have very incredible, professional staff on different, House and Senate committees that are providing some expertise, but they're totally outmanned and outdone compared to the private sector lobbyists that are coming in, right? So building the government's independent capacity to assess and understand these things and kind of come to its own conclusions, I think is one. Two, on the conflict piece in particular, the role of humans staying in the loop and meaningfully staying in the loop is a really important one to me. I think it's a really dangerous, what the Department of War under Secretary Hesketh has been really pursuing to try to remove the human from the loop. But honestly, the human in the loop right now as it stands is pretty insignificant, right? We all know that feeling of, I worked with Claude on something and made some recommendation to me, and like I can go read through all the logic in the whole report, or I can sort of basically just like approve what it said, and all the incentives are just like move fast, move forward, skim it and move on. The same thing happens in conflict zones, right? Your targeting system, your AI generated target system comes up with a target. The humans have very little time to independently verify, to understand what the civilian casualty rate is going to be, what the trade-offs are, who exactly is this target. I mean, some of the Israeli reporting from 972 magazine basically said like Israeli operatives basically had 20 seconds to verify whether the target was male, and that was basically it. That's a very dangerous thing to me, and so I think particularly when we think about the norms around violence, that's a really important one. And last, I just think this piece around, the role that governments and, other actors have, their sort of procurement capacity as buyers of these systems, what they can use, their sort of buying capacity and what they can demand from the developers is really important, right? Creating these kind of clear technical explanations for expectations for suppliers really is important. Creating some sort of standard that we expect every single supplier to provide, I think is an important one. And again, you don't want this sort of patchwork system across every single township and province and around the world got a different set of standards. You want some consistency so that suppliers have something that they're building towards and know that they have to build towards. And I very much believe that all these incredible companies that are developing these systems, they can push forward on incredible innovation while meeting these, expectations for suppliers at the same time if they know what they're going to be. And I think they can do both those simultaneously without feeling necessarily like you're slowing everything down and you're going to let some other country win the AI race.
amazing? And then last question. So we have some of this productive framework that you just mentioned, but what is, I guess, the one takeaway or one thing that you see on the horizon? I mean, I don't expect you to, come up with a black swan event for everyone, but from your experience, just given patterns that you've seen in work or just across all these different spaces, what do you think? And we've talked about a lot, so there's a lot to focus on. But if there was one thing you would really encourage, whether this be government policymakers or multinational companies, what is, I guess, the biggest looming challenge that you see as a main threat that people are not focusing on that you wish they paid more attention to?
Yeah, I think, the sort of very concrete threat I've been thinking about a lot is the proliferation risk. And AI is not really thought about in those terms. Maybe AGI a little bit, but most of the models are not really thought of as proliferation risks. But again, as we've seen the way that drones and AI targeting systems have changed conflict, we're going to see those things come together, and we're going to see them come together for, authoritarian regimes or particularly violent regimes. We're also going to see them come together for non-state armed actors, whether they are rebel groups or terrorist groups. And I think thinking a little bit more critically around the proliferation risk involved and what guardrails we want to see around that is a really important one. But then I think, kind of from the perspective of, people that are innovating and developing and want to see adoption of these AI technologies and believe very strongly in the power of these technologies to, improve things, not just hurt things. I think understanding who your user is and understanding kind of who your consumer is and what you're trying to get them to do, what systems they have in place is very important. I'll just relate just as an example from, again, my work on the kind of climate adaptation space. There are all these incredible private sector companies that are inventing new tools and systems for climate adaptation, right? Helping people address the worst impacts of the climate crisis. And a lot of these are developed in university labs or private sector companies, and then they go to conflict-affected communities or fragile or low-income places in the global south, which they have very little relationship or understanding of. And they basically say, here's this new tool. Isn't this great? Throw out everything you have and basically use our tool in place to manage your climate risk. And the reality is that all these communities, whether you are the most technologically sophisticated communities in the world in Japan, or whether you're the least technologically sophisticated communities, they have systems in place to deal with climate risk. They have systems in place to deal with resilience. They're often community-based systems. They might be built on civil society and NGOs. They're very local. They're often not national. And if you're just trying to substitute and replace what they have, like, you're never going to be effective. You have to figure out, like, how do I enhance your existing system? How do I add to and work around your incentives, your needs, et cetera? And I think this is one of the places that, again, the humanitarian in me sees so many people, but from the development sector or the tech sector or other sectors, come into communities and basically tell them, throw out everything you know. We think you know better than you. Let's replace your whole system with this. And that's just never going to be a recipe for success. So for companies or people that are really interested in the adoption of these technologies and tools, I just really encourage, get to know communities and local-based systems and respect the fact that these systems have value and these communities have been dealing with these problems for many years. They may actually know something about what their community needs and may not want to throw everything out just because you've invented something new.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, we see that across conflict, across environment, even with, data centers in the US. There are so many different ways that can be discussed. But yes, oftentimes we can see kind of in the pursuit of speed or diffusion, they can forget to involve different communities. So I think that's a wonderful point. Anyway, I want to say thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. This was a very compelling, very large conversation. We covered a lot of ground. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Chelsea, and thanks for all the work you're doing with the podcast.
For sure. Well, make sure to tune in for more. And Ken, definitely would love to have you back on the podcast soon.
Thanks so much.